The Matthews family had just settled into their new home on Ponderosa Drive, a tree-lined street in a quiet suburban neighborhood. It was the fresh start Sarah and Ethan had been yearning for. A place where their teenage daughter, Sophia, could finish high school without the distractions of their old, crowded city apartment. A neighborhood where everyone seemed to know everyone, where lawns were neatly trimmed, and the houses all looked like they had been plucked from a picture book. The house itself was modest but charming, nestled at the end of a cul-de-sac with a white picket fence and a sprawling front yard. It was a perfect fit for the family. The kids at Sophia's new school had been friendly enough, and she was beginning to make friends. Ethan had secured a job at a local company, and Sarah was content with her freelance work. Everything was falling into place. But nothing, not even the quiet suburban bliss they thought they had found, could escape the watchful eye of Karen Reynolds. Karen was the president of the local HOA, a position she carried with an almost religious fervor. From the first moment Sarah had met her, she sensed something off. There was a rigidity about Karen that felt almost oppressive. Still, Sarah and Ethan had been in the neighborhood for just a few days, and they were eager to fit in, so they greeted Karen politely, if not warmly. "Welcome to the neighborhood," Karen had said, shaking Sarah's hand with an unervingly firm grip. "I'm the HOA president, and it's my job to make sure we all follow the rules around here. It's a great community. You'll love it." The words were warm, but the way Karen said them made Sarah feel like she was being evaluated, scrutinized under a magnifying glass. There was an intensity in her eyes that was impossible to ignore. As the days passed, Sarah began to notice the little things. A neighbor would casually mention that Karen had commented on their lawn not being perfectly even. Another neighbor remarked that Karen had suggested they keep their garage door closed during the day, to keep up appearances. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a neighbor with too much time on her hands. But then Karen came by their house to remind them about a few things. Ethan had just come home from work when she knocked on the door, a clipboard in hand. "Ethan," she greeted him in a tone that bordered on condescending, "I just wanted to remind you about the HOA rules." "I thought we were all good," Ethan replied, trying to mask the frustration in his voice. They had moved here for peace and quiet, not to be policed. "Well, it's just a friendly reminder," Karen continued, her eyes scanning the yard. "You need to trim those hedges. The HOA requires that they be kept to a certain height. And the parking in front of the house, some neighbors have commented about it. You don't want to upset anyone." Ethan bit his tongue, his eyes narrowing slightly. He had no problem with rules, he just didn't want to be micromanaged. "I'll get to it. Thanks for the reminder," Ethan said curtly, stepping back, trying to close the door without appearing rude. Karen didn't move. "And the noise on weekends," she added, her voice turning sharp, as if suddenly irritated. "You'll want to keep it down. The sound travels far, and we don't want any complaints." A chill ran down Sarah's spine as she overheard the exchange. They hadn't even hosted a party or done anything out of the ordinary. Yet Karen was already finding fault. This wasn't just about rules, it was about control. The visits from Karen didn't stop after that. In fact, they became more frequent. Each time she came by, it was for something else. The mailbox was a bit too far from the curb, according to her. The bushes on the side of the house needed trimming to meet community standards. Each reminder was wrapped in a smile, but the edge to Karen's tone made it clear that this wasn't just about keeping the neighborhood nice. It was about establishing dominance, asserting her control over every detail of their lives. It was a Friday afternoon when Karen came by for the last time. Sophia had just finished her homework and was playing in the front yard when Karen approached once again. This time, Ethan was inside, and Sarah was standing at the kitchen counter, silently watching from the window. Karen's expression was as cold as ever as she spoke to Sophia. "You're too close to the edge of the driveway," she said, her tone flat. "I've warned you before, stay in the yard." The HOA doesn't allow kids to play near the boundary. Sophia looked confused. I wasn't doing anything wrong. I was just playing catch. I don't care, Karen snapped, her voice getting louder. The rules are the rules. You need to learn them. Your parents should have told you by now. Jessica's heart sank as she watched this unfold. This wasn't just a matter of enforcing rules anymore. This was Karen exerting control over their daughter. Sophia stood her ground, visibly upset. It's just a game, she said, her voice trembling. I wasn't hurting anyone. No one even complained about me being here. Maybe not, but someone will if you don't learn how to behave, Karen shot back, her eyes narrowing as she stared down at Sophia. You'll see. With that, Karen turned on her heel, leaving Sophia standing in the yard, shaken. Sarah felt her blood boil with frustration. What had started as a small annoyance was now becoming a real problem. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules, she was bullying them, trying to bend their family to her will. That evening, after Sophia had gone to bed, Ethan and Sarah sat in the living room, discussing the events of the day. She's got to be stopped, Ethan muttered, his hands rubbing his face in frustration. She's not the boss of us. We can't let her keep pushing us around like this. I know, Sarah said quietly, shaking her head. But I'm afraid of what happens if we stand up to her. She's part of everything here. What if she makes our lives even harder? That's the point, Ethan said, his voice hardening. If we don't stand up to her now, she'll keep doing this, on and on, until we're too scared to even leave the house. Sarah felt a cold knot form in her stomach. She had always believed that people should be kind, but this wasn't just about being kind anymore. This was about survival. As they sat in silence, the weight of the situation settled over them. The quiet suburban life they had wanted, where their daughter could grow up without the burdens of the city, was slipping further and further away. The storm was coming, and Karen was at the center of it. But what could they do? How could they stand up to her without making everything worse? Sarah didn't know yet. But she was starting to realize that they had no choice. The evening had started like any other. The smell of homemade lasagna filled the air as Sarah set the table, the soft hum of the radio playing in the background. Sophia was upstairs finishing her homework, and Ethan was in the living room, flipping through channels on the TV. It was a typical Friday night, nothing extraordinary, just a quiet family evening. But then, the knock came. Sarah opened the door to find Karen standing on the porch, her expression tight and stern. She was holding a piece of paper in her hand, her posture rigid as she looked at Sarah. "Good evening, Sarah," Karen said, her voice as polite as it was cold. "I hope you're doing well. I just wanted to bring this to your attention." She handed Sarah the paper, a formal complaint about the noise level from their house the previous weekend. Sarah blinked in surprise. "Noise? We didn't have a party, Karen. It was just a few friends over for a movie night." "Well, according to my neighbors, there was a lot of noise coming from your house," Karen said, her voice rising slightly. "You need to be mindful of the noise. It's a disturbance to the community. The HOA has rules for a reason." Sarah could feel the irritation creeping up her spine, but she forced a smile. "We didn't mean to disturb anyone, Karen. It won't happen again." "Good," Karen replied, her eyes narrowing. "I'll be filing this complaint with the HOA. If you don't follow the rules, you might find yourself in trouble. Just a warning." Before Sarah could respond, Karen turned and walked off, her heels clicking sharply on the pavement. Sarah stood there for a moment, her brow furrowed. She was used to Karen's overbearing nature by now, but this was different. A formal complaint over a harmless movie night? It felt petty, yet Karen had a way of making everything feel like a bigger issue than it was. Sarah shook her head, dismissing it as just another one of Karen's attempts to assert control. Later that night, after dinner, Ethan and Sarah sat in the living room, talking about the complaint. Sophia was already in her room, her face buried in a book. The evening was winding down, and Ethan was starting to feel the effects of the long week. "Karen is unbelievable," Ethan muttered, shaking his head. "A noise complaint for a movie night? It's ridiculous." "I know," Sarah replied with a sigh. "But you know how she is. Always looking for something to complain about. She's made it clear she thinks she's the law around here." "I'm sick of her trying to control everything," Ethan said, his voice thick with frustration. "She thinks she owns this neighborhood." "I get it," Sarah said softly, "but let it go. She's not worth it." But Ethan wasn't letting it go. He stood up abruptly, running his hands through his hair. "No, I'm tired of being polite about it. I'm going to talk to her. Tell her she's out of line." "Ethan, please," Sarah said, her voice tinged with concern. "Don't escalate it. We don't need another confrontation with Karen. You know how she gets." Ethan paused at the door, his jaw clenched. "I'll be fine. I just need to tell her she's gone too far." Sarah stood up, stepping toward him. "Just, don't make it worse, okay?" But Ethan didn't seem to hear her. He opened the door, stepping out onto the porch without another word. Sarah watched him from the window, her stomach twisting with unease. There was something in Ethan's demeanor that worried her. This wasn't just a casual conversation, this was Ethan standing up to someone who had been making their lives miserable for weeks. She tried to shake off the feeling, but it lingered. Minutes later, the sound of a loud bang shattered the quiet night. The noise was so sudden, so sharp, that Sarah felt her heart stop in her chest. She bolted up, her hands shaking as she rushed toward the door. "Sophia, stay inside," she yelled as she ran past her daughter's room, her mind racing with panic. What was that? A car backfiring? No, it was too loud. Too deliberate. The next thing she heard was a scream, a strangled, broken sound that tore through the house. It was Ethan's voice. She didn't know what it meant, but the fear in it was unmistakable. Without thinking, Sarah rushed out the door, her eyes searching frantically for Ethan. And then, she saw him. He was lying in the driveway, his body sprawled unnaturally on the cold pavement, blood pooling around him. "Ethan!" Sarah screamed, rushing toward him, but her legs felt as if they were moving through molasses. Her mind refused to process what she was seeing. She knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she reached for his pulse. He was still breathing, barely, but the blood on his chest told her everything she needed to know. He was badly hurt. The wound was deep, the blood soaking through his shirt in a growing pool. It wasn't until she heard the sound of footsteps behind her that she realized someone else was approaching. Karen appeared from the shadows, walking toward them, a smug look still on her face. She held a gun in her hands, the barrel pointed toward the ground, but the weapon was unmistakable. I thought he was an intruder," Karen said, her voice shaky but trying to remain calm. "He came at me, he was the one who..." She stopped, her words hanging in the air as she looked at Ethan, lying motionless in the driveway. Sarah couldn't comprehend the words. She looked at Karen, disbelief washing over her. You shot him?" Her voice cracked, but the rage was there, bubbling to the surface. "Why? What are you talking about? He wasn't doing anything." "I had to protect myself," Karen repeated, her eyes flicking nervously between Ethan and Sarah. "He came out of nowhere, he was aggressive. I thought he was going to hurt me." The words didn't make sense. Ethan wasn't holding a weapon. He wasn't a threat. He was her husband, her best friend, the father of their daughter. And Karen had just shot him. "Karen," Sarah gasped, struggling to breathe. You murdered him." Tears welled in her eyes as she cradled Ethan's head in her lap, her voice shaking. She could hear Sophia's frantic steps approaching behind her. She didn't know what to do. She didn't know how to stop the blood that was staining her hands, her soul. The police arrived quickly after that, but it all felt surreal. They questioned Karen, but her story didn't make sense. She claimed it was self-defense against an intruder. But Ethan had never been aggressive, never threatened anyone. The truth began to seep through the cracks in her story. As paramedics loaded Ethan into the ambulance, Karen was escorted away by the officers, but Sarah couldn't make herself move. She couldn't take her eyes off the spot where Ethan had fallen, blood staining the pavement. All she could think was, why? Why had Karen done this? What had gone wrong? And how could she live with the fact that her husband was gone, just like that, in a split second? The nightmare had just begun. The moment the gunshot rang out, time seemed to stand still. Sarah's world went into a freefall, a gut-wrenching, terrifying tumble that she couldn't stop. She had heard the scream, Ethan's scream, and then the deafening, explosive bang that followed. Every muscle in her body screamed at her to run outside, to save him, to do something. But when she saw him lying there in the driveway, blood staining the concrete, her feet felt like they were glued to the floor. Ethan. Sarah's voice cracked as she fell to her knees beside him. His blood was already beginning to pool around him, dark and spreading like an unstoppable tide. His face was pale, his breathing shallow, but he was still alive. She could feel his pulse, weak but there, and in that moment, she thought maybe, just maybe, he would pull through. But everything was happening so fast. Sophia came running out the door, her face twisted in confusion and terror. "Mom? What happened? What's wrong with Dad?" Sarah couldn't even answer. She could only look at her daughter, helpless, desperate to do something to protect her, to protect Ethan, but there was nothing she could do. The sirens were already wailing in the distance, and within moments, the police arrived. As the officers swarmed the front yard, Karen stood off to the side, her hands trembling but her face calm. She didn't look like someone who had just shot a man. Instead, she looked like a woman who had been caught in a frightening, unavoidable situation. But there was something about her, something in the way she held herself, too calm, too composed, that set Sarah's teeth on edge. The officers began asking questions, but Karen spoke before anyone could get a word in. "It was self-defense," she said, her voice tight but controlled. "He came at me, an intruder in my own yard. I didn't have a choice." Sarah felt her blood run cold. An intruder? Ethan? The man who had been nothing but kind to her and their daughter? Who had never so much as raised his voice to anyone, let alone Karen. "What do you mean, an intruder?" Sarah demanded, her voice rising despite herself. "He's my husband. He was not an intruder. You shot him. He wasn't threatening you." But Karen didn't flinch. "I'm sorry, but I had to protect myself. I was in my yard, minding my business, and he came out of nowhere. He looked like he was going to hurt me, so I fired. I'm sorry, but I was scared for my life. I didn't want to kill him." Sarah's chest tightened with rage and disbelief. She opened her mouth to argue, to scream that this wasn't true, but the words felt stuck in her throat. The pain of seeing Ethan lying there, unable to defend himself, the injustice of it all tangled together inside her. The officers took down Karen's statement with professional detachment. But it was clear to Sarah that Karen had already played her hand. Her version of events, her calm demeanor, all of it worked in her favor. This wasn't just a self-defense claim, it was a performance. And Karen was nailing it. After Karen had given her statement to the police, the officers turned to the neighbors. Sarah could hear murmurs of conversation, some voices raised, others hushed, but none of it felt real. How could they believe her? How could anyone believe that Ethan, her husband, the father of their daughter, had been anything but innocent? Sarah tried to stay composed as the officers took statements from the neighbors, but every word that came from their mouths felt like a stab to her heart. "I heard shouting earlier," one neighbor said. "Then I heard the gunshot. I didn't see anything, but it was clear that there was some sort of altercation." Another neighbor added, "I didn't see Ethan or Karen directly, but I heard the yelling, and then the gun went off. I wasn't sure what was happening, but it sounded like a confrontation." None of them had actually witnessed the shooting. Not one person had seen what really happened. They had heard things, yes. They'd heard shouting, maybe a struggle, but no one had actually seen Ethan, unarmed, unthreatening, get shot in cold blood. Meanwhile, Karen stood off to the side, her arms crossed, the calmest person in the yard. She nodded at the officer's questions, answering with rehearsed precision. "I had to act quickly," she told one officer, her voice steady. "It was an intruder. I didn't have time to think. I just reacted." As Sarah listened to the witnesses, the pieces started to fall into place. Karen's story was taking shape, a story that was self-defense, a story where Ethan was the villain, the aggressor, the threat. The more she heard, the more she realized how Karen was twisting everything in her favor. How could Sarah prove otherwise? How could she make the truth, Ethan's truth, heard when everyone around them was so quick to believe Karen? The police left after gathering the initial statements, leaving Sarah and Sophia alone in the quiet of their front yard, the bloodstains from Ethan's body still fresh in the grass. The investigation was just beginning, but Sarah knew that she couldn't wait for the system to work at its own pace. She couldn't trust that the truth would come out on its own. She needed to find the truth herself. She began to ask around, quietly, talking to neighbors who hadn't yet spoken, digging for anything that could expose the lie. She couldn't just sit back and let Karen get away with this. There had to be something in Karen's past, some crack in her story, something that would make people question her version of events. Sarah spoke to a few neighbors who were sympathetic, who had never quite liked Karen. One neighbor, Terry, mentioned how Karen had often been overly controlling with other people's property. "She doesn't care who she hurts as long as she gets what she wants," Terry had said, her voice low. "She's always been like that, even with her own family." Sarah was struck by that. Karen had always been obsessed with control, always wanting to be the one who made the rules, who enforced the boundaries. Had that control extended to the point where Karen felt justified in shooting someone who challenged her? Someone who dared to question her authority? The more Sarah dug, the more she uncovered. Neighbors recalled how Karen would patrol the street at night, making sure everyone followed her vision of the perfect neighborhood. She had a history of accusing people of things, parking violations, noise complaints, and always believed she was right. But shooting Ethan in cold blood? That was something entirely different. But Karen was still a master manipulator. Her carefully constructed story had already begun to take root in the minds of the neighbors, and Sarah knew that she would need more than just gut feelings to expose the truth. As Sarah sat on the edge of the porch, watching the police car disappear down the street, she knew one thing for sure: Karen had to be stopped. And she would do whatever it took to make sure that the truth came out, no matter how long it took. The days after Ethan's death felt like a blur for Sarah. There were police reports to file, interviews to sit through, and a constant undercurrent of fear and frustration. But it wasn't just the emotional toll that weighed heavily on her, it was the crushing reality of the legal system, and the dawning realization that Karen might just get away with murder. Sarah hired a lawyer, someone with experience in criminal cases, but even the attorney seemed unsure of how to proceed. Karen's claim of self-defense was solid, at least on the surface. She had shot Ethan, but she had spun the story with such precision that it was hard for anyone to argue otherwise. She had told the police she feared for her life, that she had seen Ethan approach her with a weapon in hand. Her words were slick, rehearsed, perfectly designed to pull the rug out from under any prosecution. The more Sarah listened to her lawyer, the more she realized the magnitude of the fight she was facing. The system seemed to be working against her. The prosecutor was hesitant to move forward with anything more than a manslaughter charge, if even that. Karen was, after all, a respected member of the community. She had been the HOA president for years, a woman known for enforcing rules and maintaining order in a way that was, frankly, admired by some. Who would believe that someone like her could murder a man in cold blood? Sarah sat in her lawyer's office, a heavy silence hanging in the air as he sifted through the case details. Self-defense claims are tough to disprove, he said, his voice tight with uncertainty. The evidence doesn't add up to anything more than a manslaughter charge. She fired once, there's no evidence of premeditation, no other witnesses who can confirm what happened. Then what are we supposed to do? Sarah's voice cracked as she fought back tears. My husband is dead, and Karen walks free? He paused, clearly uncomfortable with her outburst, but gave a small nod. The justice system doesn't always deliver the outcome we want, Sarah. But we'll dig deeper. We'll keep pushing. We just need more. More? Sarah's mind raced. What else could they find? Karen's story was airtight. There were no witnesses, no forensic evidence that could definitively prove Ethan had been unarmed, that he hadn't been a threat. The only truth was that Karen had shot him in cold blood, and she was getting away with it. Sarah refused to give up. If the legal system wasn't going to do its job, she would do it herself. She began digging into Karen's life, desperate for something, anything, that would shine a light on Karen's true nature. It wasn't long before she started finding cracks in Karen's perfect image. The neighbors, once so quiet about their opinions of Karen, began to open up. At first, they were reluctant, unwilling to get involved. But slowly, they started sharing their stories. She's controlling, one neighbor admitted, his voice low. I've seen her yell at people for the smallest things. Parking too close to the curb, leaving trash cans out too long. She acts like she's in charge of everything. Another neighbor, a woman named Terry, was more blunt. She's got a temper. I've had a few run-ins with her about things that weren't even her business. I've heard her scream at people before. Karen likes to make people feel small. Like they're beneath her. These small bits of information began to paint a much darker picture of Karen. She wasn't just a petty HOA president, she was a woman who had been manipulating and controlling those around her for years. But was this just a pattern of bad behavior, or had Karen escalated it to something far worse? Sarah's instincts told her that this wasn't just a random act of violence. This was the culmination of Karen's years of controlling behavior. Ethan had been the last straw. Karen had seen him as an obstacle to her power, someone who challenged her authority. And when he stood up to her, when he dared to push back, she had taken matters into her own hands. The more Sarah learned, the more certain she became. This wasn't a case of self-defense. Karen had murdered Ethan, and she had manipulated the entire neighborhood into believing her story. With the help of her lawyer, Sarah started to piece together a case. They dug through public records, old HOA complaints, and anything they could find that might reveal Karen's history of aggression. What they uncovered sent chills down Sarah's spine. There were multiple complaints from neighbors about Karen's overreach, her tendency to escalate minor issues into full-blown conflicts. In fact, Karen had been investigated for a harassment case years earlier, when she had aggressively pursued a neighbor over a trivial dispute about property lines. The case had been dismissed, but the pattern was undeniable. Karen had a history of controlling behavior, of bullying people who didn't follow her rules. More than that, Sarah uncovered old police reports that hinted at Karen's troubled past. There were mentions of verbal altercations, police visits to her home for domestic disturbances, and even a brief investigation into a violent incident involving Karen and her ex-husband. While the case had never gone to trial, the details were unsettling. Karen had a long history of reacting to perceived slights with escalating violence, and Ethan had simply been the latest victim in a long line of targets. With this new evidence, Sarah felt a surge of determination. She wasn't going to let Karen get away with this. The system might be slow, and the police might not have enough evidence yet, but Sarah had what Karen could not hide, the truth. But even as Sarah dug deeper, the pressure mounted. The neighborhood was beginning to turn against her. Some of Karen's most vocal supporters were now speaking out, claiming Karen had done what any of them would have done if faced with an intruder. The public perception of Karen as a pillar of the community weighed heavily on the investigation. Sarah knew that the truth was on her side, but the truth wasn't always enough. She had to find a way to make others see it, to make them understand that Karen was a predator hiding behind the facade of a respectable neighbor. Sarah didn't stop. She reached out to former colleagues, digging through more records, finding more witnesses. Finally, she tracked down Terry, who had once been a victim of Karen's bullying. Terry agreed to testify, confirming the pattern of behavior and helping to paint a clearer picture of Karen's true nature. With Terry's testimony, along with the evidence of Karen's manipulative tactics and violent history, Sarah finally felt like the pieces were coming together. The case wasn't just about self-defense anymore, it was about a woman who had systematically broken down the people around her and had, in the end, murdered someone who stood up to her. The police investigation began to gain momentum, the cracks in Karen's story becoming harder and harder to ignore. For the first time, Sarah allowed herself to believe that they could win. It wasn't just about getting justice for Ethan, it was about exposing the monster Karen had hidden behind a mask for so long. But the fight wasn't over yet. The deeper Sarah dug, the more dangerous it became. Karen would stop at nothing to protect herself. But Sarah was ready. She wouldn't rest until the truth was known. The battle for justice was just beginning, and Sarah was more determined than ever to see it through to the end. The sun had barely begun to set when Sarah arrived at Karen's house, her heart pounding in her chest. She had spent weeks gathering evidence, speaking to neighbors, digging into Karen's past. She had been patient, determined, but she had reached her limit. The lies, the manipulation, the facade of self-defense, Karen's version of events was a carefully constructed lie, and Sarah wasn't going to let it stand anymore. It was time to confront Karen directly. Sarah had tried to stay civil, had tried to follow the rules, but Karen had crossed a line. Ethan was dead, and Karen was responsible. Sarah wouldn't stop until the truth came out, no matter what it took. As she stood at the door of Karen's house, her mind raced. The day had come. This confrontation wasn't just about justice, it was about Ethan and Sophia, about ending the fear Karen had imposed on their lives. Sarah had tried to move on, to focus on healing, but how could she heal when Karen was still out there, free to manipulate the world as she pleased? Taking a deep breath, Sarah rang the doorbell. The seconds ticked by, each one dragging on longer than the last. When the door opened, Karen stood there, her cold eyes narrowing as she saw Sarah standing in front of her. "You've got some nerve," Karen sneered, but Sarah didn't flinch. She had come too far to be intimidated. "I need answers, Karen," Sarah said, her voice steady but filled with intensity. "You murdered my husband. And I'm here to make you admit it." Karen stepped back, a cold smile playing on her lips. "Murder? Don't be dramatic, Sarah," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I was simply defending myself from an intruder. Your husband attacked me. You know how it goes." "You're lying," Sarah replied, her voice rising with emotion. "You've been lying from the beginning. Ethan wasn't a threat. He was trying to talk to you, Karen. He wasn't coming after you with a knife or trying to hurt you. You shot him in cold blood." Karen stepped back, her face hardening. "You don't know what it's like to be in fear, Sarah," she hissed. "I'm the one who was threatened. Your husband was a threat to me. I had to protect myself. You don't know what it's like to feel your life is in danger. You never did anything to stop him. But I did." Sarah's fists clenched at her sides. "You've been manipulating this entire neighborhood, Karen," she said, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. You've used your position as HOA president to control people. You've used fear to get what you want. And when someone stood up to you, someone who wasn't afraid of you, you killed him. Ethan wasn't just a threat, he was the one person who didn't bow down to you, and you couldn't handle that. Karen's face twisted with rage, but she held her ground. You don't know what you're talking about. Ethan was just a man who couldn't see how things should be. He was the problem. I had to fix it. I had to protect myself. No, Sarah spat, her words coming out with venom. You killed him because you knew Ethan wouldn't back down. You planned this for weeks. You knew you could push him far enough, get him to stand up to you. You manipulated the whole neighborhood, and when Ethan finally confronted you, you saw your chance. You were the one who escalated it. You shot him in cold blood. And you thought you could get away with it. Karen's face paled, her lips quivering with rage. For the first time, the mask of composure slipped. I didn't mean to, she stammered, but Sarah wasn't done. Yes, you did, Sarah shot back. You planned it. You knew what you were doing. You're not the victim here. You're a cold-blooded murderer. In that moment, Karen's eyes filled with fear. She had underestimated Sarah, she had thought that by controlling the narrative, by twisting the story, she could walk away scot-free. But Sarah wasn't just standing there to take her lies anymore. She had fought for Ethan, and she would fight for the truth. The confrontation didn't end there. As Sarah left Karen's house, the weight of what had just happened hung heavy in the air. The words Karen had said, the rage in her eyes, it was all too clear. Karen had never been afraid of Ethan. She had never been in any danger. She had killed him because he was the one person who had dared to challenge her control, her grip on the neighborhood. But even though Sarah knew the truth, the community didn't. Karen's followers were still loyal to her, convinced by the story she had told. The neighborhood was divided. Some people stood by Sarah, and some clung to Karen's narrative of self-defense. The whispers continued, the rumors spread, and the damage to Sarah's life only deepened. But Sarah was unshaken. She had confronted Karen, exposed the lies, and in doing so, she had torn away the mask Karen had been hiding behind for so long. The final stage of the battle was in the courtroom. The evidence Sarah had gathered, Karen's history of manipulation, her actions on the night of the shooting, the neighbor testimonies, and Karen's own words, painted a clear picture of premeditated murder. The defense couldn't counter the mounting evidence. The lies Karen had told began to unravel, and the jury began to see through her carefully constructed facade. The day of the verdict arrived, and the courtroom was packed. Sarah sat at the front, her heart pounding. She had been through so much, and this was the final step. She held her breath as the jury filed back into the courtroom, the weight of the moment almost unbearable. The judge asked for their verdict, and the tension in the room could have been sliced with a knife. Karen Reynolds, we find you guilty of second-degree murder. The words echoed through the room like a thunderclap. Sarah's heart raced, but there was no relief. No joy. The cost had been too high. Ethan was gone, and Sophia had lost her father. But at least the truth had come out. The courtroom was quiet as Karen was led away, her face a mask of disbelief and anger. Some in the room whispered, their eyes fixed on Karen as she was escorted out. The neighborhood would never be the same. Some defended Karen, believing she had acted in self-defense, while others mourned the loss of Ethan and the years they had wasted trusting Karen. But for Sarah, it was over. Karen had been convicted, but nothing would ever bring back the life they had lost. As Sarah left the courthouse, Sophia beside her, she took a deep breath. The road had been long, the battle hard, but in the end, they had found justice. And for the first time since that horrible night, Sarah felt a glimmer of peace. She would carry the pain of Ethan's loss with her always, but she had fought for him, for Sophia, and for the truth. And that, at least, was something. The house they now lived in was nothing like the one on Ponderosa Drive. It was smaller, simpler, tucked away on a quiet street far from the memories of Ethan's death. But it was theirs, and that was what mattered. The air felt lighter here, the walls untainted by the violence that had once stained their family's life. It wasn't a fresh start, they both knew that. Nothing could erase what had happened, but this house, this new life, offered them the chance to heal. The first few days in the new place were quiet. Sarah and Sophia unpacked their belongings with slow, careful movements, as though the act of setting up their home could somehow help them put the past behind them. Sophia was quieter than usual, as if she were waiting for something, or perhaps, trying to avoid something. Her bedroom had been carefully arranged, the same comforter she'd always loved spread over the bed, but it didn't feel like Sophia had truly settled in yet. As the days passed, Sophia began to return to some of the things she had once enjoyed. Her sketchbook, which had been gathering dust for months, reappeared on her desk. It was a small step, but it was a start. Every time Sarah checked on her daughter, she saw the tentative way Sophia held the pencil, as though afraid to pour her heart out onto the page. But Sarah could see the change, see the spark of life coming back into her. Slowly, Sophia started to find her voice again. She returned to school with a quiet strength, facing her classmates, even though every day felt like a battle. She spoke less about the past, but her silence spoke volumes. Sarah couldn't help but feel proud of Sophia. In so many ways, her daughter had already begun to heal, even if it was a process neither of them fully understood. The scars from that night, the emotional wounds that no one could see, would never disappear. But with time, both Sarah and Sophia began to understand something essential. Life was not about forgetting, it was about learning to live again. Months passed, and with each passing day, the pain seemed a little more manageable, though it never fully went away. The grief of losing Ethan was something Sarah carried with her like a shadow, always there, always heavy, but not as suffocating as it had been in those early days. There were moments when she would catch herself looking at Sophia and feel a pang in her heart, a reminder of the family they had lost. She could still see Ethan's face in her mind, hear his voice in the soft hum of the house, but she had learned to carry that with her rather than let it break her. The trial was over. The justice that Sarah had fought for had been served. Karen was convicted, and though it didn't bring Ethan back, it had been a necessary step. The truth had finally been acknowledged, the lies exposed. Sarah had given everything she could to make sure Ethan's death wasn't just swept under the rug, and in the end, she had succeeded. But even with the conviction, the journey of healing was far from complete. Every day, Sarah had to find new ways to cope, to move forward. She had days where she felt strong, days when she could smile and remember the good times with Ethan. But there were other days, too, the days when the grief would resurface, uninvited, and she would feel the ache in her chest like it was happening all over again. Those days, she clung to Sophia for strength. They had each other, and in that, there was comfort. As Sarah sat by the window one evening, watching the sunset with Sophia beside her, she reflected on everything she had been through. The pain, the fear, the fight for justice, it had all led her here, to this moment, with her daughter, safe and healing, in the quiet of their new home. She had done everything she could for Ethan and Sophia, everything she could to ensure that Karen didn't get away with it. She had fought with every ounce of her being, and she could walk away knowing she had done right by her family. In the stillness of that evening, Sarah found a sense of closure. Not the kind that wiped away all the pain, but the kind that allowed her to move forward. She could finally say, without guilt or regret, that she had done everything she could for justice. And now, it was time to live again. Sophia looked up at her mother, as if sensing the shift in the air. She didn't say anything at first, but when she did, her voice was soft but filled with an unexpected strength. "I miss him," Sophia whispered, her voice barely above a sigh. Sarah put her arm around Sophia, holding her close. "I know, sweetheart. I miss him too." For a long time, They sat there in silence, the weight of everything that had happened hanging in the air, but there was something different now, something that hadn't been there before. It was a quiet acceptance. Ethan was gone, but they were still here. And that was enough. As time went on, Sarah and Sophia began to embrace the future. The pain of Ethan's death would never fully fade, but it no longer ruled their lives. They had created a new routine, a new rhythm, in their new home. Sophia was finding herself again, rediscovering her love for art, for life. Sarah had started volunteering at a local shelter, finding purpose in helping others who had gone through their own struggles. The scars of the past would always be with them, but they were no longer the defining feature of their lives. Sarah had learned to find peace, not in forgetting, but in accepting. She had given her all for justice, and in the end, that was what mattered most. For the first time since Ethan's death, Sarah felt hopeful. Not because the pain had gone away, but because she and Sophia had learned to live with it. They had survived, together, and that was more than enough. As they sat together in the quiet of their home, the weight of the world felt a little lighter. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time, they were ready to face it. Together.